Hi and welcome to Product Manager Localization 101. Today we're going to talk about best practice processes for product localization, translation and internationalization. My name is Damian Scattergood and I'm the Managing Director of Star Translation Services here in Dublin. So why is localization important? Let's start with a simple question. So at the end of the day, bottom line is if you have bad translation on a product, it will impact your business. It impacts your sales. It makes your job harder to do as a product manager or a localization engineer, and it will impact your customer support. So if it's difficult for your customer to use, it's also going to be difficult for you as well. It's difficult for you to support, right? So there are sort of the key things. So what are we going to talk about today? If you look around the internet, it's very easy to find examples of bad translation and mistranslation, and some are funny and some are not so funny. Even when you go on holidays, it's easy to see signs in places that are mistranslated, and you don't really have to look far to find bad translation in product descriptions. As a product manager, there's a number of key areas you need to cover in your localization process. And we're going to discuss these in about 15 to 20 minutes today and give you a number of key takeaways that you'll be able to use straight away. So typically, localization really starts with the design of your product, and you need to start thinking around these issues in the English product first. So, for example, most people may not know that text will grow up to 30% in length. So German is typically a very long language. So when you've got a dialog box or something, the text is going to get bigger after you translate it. So if you design lots of white space in, it can sort of help you. Things like how you're going to get the text in and out for translation. So if it's a software application, depending on how it's developed, how are you going to extract the strings, how are you going to translate the strings, and how are you going to put them back in. Now that sounds very simple, but it can be a lot more complicated than that, because there's many different CMS systems, for example. If you're working with InDesign, you know how you're going to do that, and there are plugins to help you do this. So you need to build that list in advance. So everything that you can see, that you can read, you need to work out how that's going to be extracted, translated and put back in again in an efficient manner. One of the things you also need to be aware of is to try and keep text off images. One of the things you see a lot of, glossy advertising on brochures and things like that, and people will put the text on the images. Now, don't put it on the image. It's actually better to use overlays instead, because overlays are more easily translated. If you have text physically drawn onto an image, it may mean you need to recreate the image itself, and that's quite an expensive and painful process. Now this list here isn't extensive, but it's sort of giving you a flavor of what's available. You also need to be aware of locale information, and on the next screen we'll talk about locale information, and that varies from country to country. Another very important thing, just in terms of a product manager's point of view, is to own your own source design assets. So when you've got a designer or an ad agency to create material for you, you need to make sure you own those assets. Sometimes you might just get a PDF back and say, well, that's your brochure. But then, if you need to update that brochure in 2 or 3 years' time, you don't have the source code, so you can't do it. And you may have to recreate that brochure. So be aware of that, because that's something we see on an ongoing basis with companies that work with external design agencies. So you need to invest time in your design and your brand. So if you think about translation before translation effectively, this will save you a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of hard work. So here's an example of just some strings where they can grow bigger, right? So I've taken 2 sample strings here. One is cancel and one is on call management. So cancel be a typical button. I've translated it into French and German, and obviously French is a little bit longer, and then German is longer again, a brecken. And in the example here, what we've done is we've actually created the buttons just so you can get a feel for what it's like. Now it's quite basic, but you get the idea. So cancel button is fine. A null is a little bit longer, but it still fits in. But then a brecken is not fitting and it's clipped. So the challenge here is that you got 2 options, right? You can either make the font smaller or you can make the button larger, and that's a problem then that either you or your translation agency will have to decide upon, right? But if you had in the first instance, if you had made the button longer 30% longer in the first place, then you wouldn't have to do either of those two tasks, and that would make the process a lot easier. Now, an extreme example, on-call management is a good case, an extreme example. If you look at the French, it's certainly longer, but the German is one really big long word, which I can't pronounce. But you get the idea that there are some languages it can get very complicated with long strings. So typically, what we ask people to do, or we advise people to do, is to design your product with 30% white space around most of your text. Like you can do that in brochures or in software, and that makes the localization process a lot easier, and a lot faster and a lot more cost efficient. So one of the things you should be doing as a product manager is when you've started to engage with your designers, whether they're designing your product or your software developers, as I say, you should start asking questions. So, for example, if you're working on a website, is the site enabled for translation? So I've seen websites that have been brought to us for translation and they're not enabled. So it's very, very difficult to translate them. So if the designers are using plugins, you need to ask it, does this plugin work in Japanese? Does it work in French? And you need to investigate everything that you are using within your products. You need to investigate that. Even if it's a software product, and you're using a code library, does that code library support localization? Or are the strings hard coded? And that's another issue for another day's conversation. And the same thing, this all relies down to how do you get the text in and out for translation? And the answer is not cut and paste. Copy and pasting, is very, it was a very old-fashioned traditional way, and it's fine for 5 or 6 strings. But when you've got, a large manual or a large website application with a couple of hundred pages, it's not feasible to do. And the reason why you ask these type of questions is that they're very expensive to fix after the design phase. So, for example, if someone's built a beta model of a product for you, and you suddenly find out that your plugin or your shopping cart plugin doesn't work in Japanese, you're in trouble. So you have to rip that out and replace it with another one, and that's a very, very expensive software engineering exercise. So the more questions you ask up front, the better. And this is where you should engage with your localization company or your translation agency to help you build this list of questions that you can ask your designers. And this is part of this presentation here. We talk about this. So here's another example of designing with translation in mind. The old-fashioned way of designing, pictures within manuals would be to have call-outs that have text on them. Now, the challenge with this is when you try and translate this text here in the call out side, it's going to get bigger. And this is a quite easy one, but imagine you had a machine diagram which had lots of little call outs on it. Very difficult to translate because the text will be longer and there'll be a lot of layout work after the translation. So a more appropriate way to do it is as the one on the right here, where you use 1, 2, and 3 with numeric call outs. It's a lot easier because you can have the text underneath, and this is actually really, really easy to translate. And there's no layout work to be done after the translation of this manual. So a very simple thing, but will save you a lot of money. And again, think about this with translation in mind. So a parting comment on this is if you can actually look at your English manual as it's being designed, and you'll see these issues. So it means you don't even have to talk to the translation company. You know where the issues are before you get to have the initial conversation with us. So locale information, as we discussed earlier on, is something that's very important in any translation and localization. And there's quite a lot of information that is included in this, and it's something you have to build up expertise on and the lists specifically to your own products and services, right? So things like date format, for example, are not the same in every country. So some countries use year, month, day. Some others would use day, month, year. The separators for time, currency and numbers are different in different countries, so that's something you need to be aware of. List separators are different, and even things like, especially from one thing we see with US products is that a lot of US products might use zip codes, for example, whereas in Europe we don't use zip codes. We would use things like postal codes or just addresses, so it's very, very different. So you need to be aware of these things, and there's a lot of different sort of various paper size, for example, whether it's A4 or whether it's letter size. So sometimes what you might find is the default settings in some applications don't work in European countries or Asian countries. So you need to be thinking about that. On a coding point of view, there are more sophisticated areas like comparing and sorting. So when you sort A to Z, or A umlaut to Z, which order do you use, and that can vary from country to country as well. So you need to be, if you're sorting text, you need to be aware of things like that as well. So that's locale information, and even further within in locale, you do need to check not just your product but also your sample files, any screenshots that are on your manuals, any screenshots you use for advertising. Sometimes, for example, you might find an image that may not be appropriate in different countries. A simple one might be you might have a picture of a car where the steering wheel is on the right hand side. Now that is perfectly fine in Europe, but may not be fine in the US. And it might be sort of something, they're sort of like subtle changes that people will pick up on, but you need to be aware of those. But you can also find inappropriate images. So, for example, certain images in the Arabic countries where you might be showing short sleeves, shirt sleeves that are short and showing a lot of arm, they can be offensive in certain countries and are not necessarily appropriate. The next thing then you need to think about is that you need to work on to protect your brand, right? So remember that when you're doing a translation, you're actually giving your brand to the localization and the translation agency, and they are the protector of that brand for you. So you need to invest time with them, right? It's actually a partnership where you're working together, right? It's not a case of just working out, where cost is the only thing, and you're trying to work out how to get the cheapest translation. Obviously, you need to be efficient and get the most cost-effective translation, right? But you need to make sure that you're getting the best translation. That means your brand is good. Like if you've built up a good brand name in English in your own country, and then you go to another country, you need to maintain that quality, right? If you ever think about when you look at everybody's seen some bad translations that have been translated from Chinese into English, for example, just to pick on one particular language. We laugh at some of those translations, and we go, "Oh, isn't this funny or isn't this bad?" But what image does that give you of that company, right? And it's the same thing for you. If you deliver a product to a company or a customer in another country, what image are they looking at, or are they portraying, are you portraying for your product? Are you coming across like a good professional company, or are you coming across that someone did something cheap? So that's one thing you need to invest in that time. So remember that good translation sells, and it helps you deliver your product much better. A part of building your brand is to manage terms and manage terminology management, right? So you need to invest in this as well to make sure it's technically accurate and it's correct. So when people talk about a table or a desk, how would you define table or a desk? What's the difference? What's the difference between an engine and a motor? And you've got specialist terms in industries like tecting. So what does tecting actually mean? And then what's tecting wait time? And what's the difference between tecting wait time and a tecting interval? So that's one for you to look up yourself. You can work out, right? But it is very important. Some people don't know what is the difference between an engine and a motor. One is powered by combustion, the other is powered by electricity. So sometimes getting those terms right will impact your translation. So if the translation is misunderstood by the translation agency, that's going to lead to bad translation. So one of the things that's important for you to remember is that good translators ask questions. So while it might be painful, sometimes you'll hear a translator going, "Oh, what's this? Have you got a picture? Can you show me that thing? What do you mean by this?" It's not them being silly. It's actually them drilling into getting an understanding of the product and what it means. So it's like a simple example. So if you tell me to dust something, right, that sounds very simple. But there are two definitions of dust something. If I am in the cleaning business, when you tell me to dust something, what that means is I will take the dust and clean it off the product. So I dust off the product. However, if I'm in the fingerprinting business and I'm a detective, when you say dust something, it means I put the dust onto something. So it's a very different process that you would use. So it shows you that something very simple can cause some miscommunications and two people, right? So if you tell a detective to dust something and I clean off all the fingerprints dust, it's not a good thing, right? And it's important to remember that short phrases two, three words are actually really hard to translate because they lack the context and they lack the meaning. So sometimes you have to go back and ask questions. Now, the solution to this is reasonably simple. You can simply just create an Excel with your key terms, put some definitions beside them, and have them translated. And then the translator has some very, very solid basis to work from. It's like building a wall. If you have the good bricks, but you'll build a good wall, right? And that's it. The words are effectively the bricks of sentences, right? Now there are some very sophisticated systems for terminology management. Like at Star, we have dictionary management systems and things like that. But at a basic level, this is where you start, and this will deliver very good quality results for you. Okay, so let's talk about context and what we're talking about. So what does this say? Most people, when they see this, will say it says 8 in a row, but that's not entirely correct. That sentence actually has many different meanings and connotations. So 8 in a row could mean 8 members disagreed and they had a row, because remember it said news at the left hand side. It could also say 8 get in a boat and they row downstream. Or I could say 8 people sitting in a row is now the new standard team format. So it's a new competition format. So the principal thing is that if each translation is different. So you can't always just take a single sentence and say that's the translation. So it's not a one-to-one relationship. So A is B, A equals B is not true for every language translation. So here's the translation of that text in its various forms. We have it in German and French. So for example, if 8 had a fight, so 8 had a row, the translation will be wheat en route. Wheat en route, should I say. If 8 had a row in a boat, then the text would be wheat en amour. And if 8 were sitting in a row, then it would be wheat dans en rangée. So principle here is that the translation is going to be different for each context. So next thing then about context is think about your own products. So what do you say that you might be confusing or ambiguous in your products or system? So if you have software systems, have you think about where the strings might appear. If I asked you to provide me a screenshot of one of your dialogues or a string, could you do it? So this is something you need to build. So as you're building your software systems, you need to think about this, right? If you've got machinery, for example, where a message is appearing, you might have a lot of short messages, especially on user interfaces or machine interfaces, because of the LED displays and things like that, or some of the low resolution displays. They don't have a lot of room for text, so text can be quite short and often abbreviated. So sometimes we need to see where the text is going to be. Example, we worked with a company where they actually sent us one of their machines, and we were able to produce every single message on that machine and produce our translations live on that machine as well. So we were able to see exactly how it would appear, and we were able to adjust the length and abbreviations of the translations appropriately before we delivered the product back to the customer. So speaking of customer language then, and how customers work is, you should always speak in a customer's tone of voice. So this is a real live example. We had a banking system that we worked with, and we were asked to translate the data warehouse beneficiary contact details. Now, I manage our finances, and I didn't know what this term meant until the guys explained to me, oh, that's the customer payee bank details, right? So in bank terms, the data warehouse is their bank information, and the payee bank details is the beneficiary contact details. So why did they not just tell me that in the first place, right? Because the key thing for me is, one is we had to translate it, but as a customer, I was playing in English. How was I supposed to use your product? So I had difficulty with our English product. And if I had difficulty with our English product, I can guarantee you that the people who I translated the system for were going to have problems with the translation. So you need to speak to your customer in their language. So when your English is understood, the translation will also be understood. And it's, this is something you see quite a lot in software applications, that software developers will use terminology that's very comfortable for software developers to speak about, but is difficult for lay people to understand, and that's something you need to always be working on. So here's an example of some bad English actually. So what does this say? So this is a sentence from a US website. So you can read it yourself, and it can mean different things. But literally, it should really say this. So the complex houses married and single soldiers and their families. So there's nothing wrong with the actual sentence. It's just that the commas are in the wrong place, right? Or there's no commas. So this will be much easier to understand and to translate. But it's still quite complicated. So why couldn't they say something like this? The housing complex provides homes for married and single soldiers and their families. Again, a bit clearer and a bit easier to understand. But they could simplify it again. Why don't they just simply say, we provide houses for soldiers and their families? And that a lot easier to translate because it's shorter, a lot easier to understand. So think about when you're writing your own manuals. Is there anything that you do that is complex and too difficult to understand in English? If it's difficult to understand in English, it's difficult to translate. So sometimes English is actually really hard to understand. And remember, if it's hard to understand in English, as I just said, it's hard to translate, right? So it's better to have tight sentences rather than long-winded phrases. Keep your terms consistent and keep your phrasing simple. And by doing this, it improves your local customers' experience and it'll improve your global customer experience. Multimedia planning then is the next key thing you need to be aware of, and that all new products really are moving into this area. You've got everything from video, audio, voice. You need to have transcription services where you actually get the script, subtitling services, and animation. So there's a lot of new media, and there's new media coming online all of the time. And there's lots of areas that you need to watch out for. So, for example, if you ask us to do a voiceover, the first thing we're going to ask you is it male or is it female? So, and depending on the area that you're delivering the content to, that might be important. Is it a serious or is it a casual? So sometimes it's just like a media briefing. You've got to actually sort of say, well, how do you want the text to be relayed? Even like sometimes if you're going for a younger market, you want the text, you want the voice to be young and hip. Do you want the speech to be like that, or do you want it to be sort of a formal instructional type video? So again, you need to be careful with that, right? Video shooting is also important in syncing. One of the things that some people think is you can't simply translate a voiceover and put it onto a video. Sometimes languages are different. So in English, you might say, "Can I help you?" But in French, you might say, "Is there something I can help?" The language is the sentence structure is the other way around. So for some product videos, if you say, and I'm opening the door, and you literally have someone's hand opening the door. If you sync it directly to that, it's very difficult to translate. So you should have text that you can overlay. So it's like if you say, and here we are opening the door, and then you have a video of somebody opening the door. It's not exactly tied one to one in terms of timing. So that's one of the things you need to be aware of. It's important as well when you're doing video that you keep your English scripts together, and you also include timing on your English script as well, because timing is important for us to be able to translate. We need to know, as you've seen earlier, that in text translation, text can be 30% longer. It's exactly the same in voice. So you can't speak faster to get text into a video. You may have to modify the video. So leaving a little bit of space between frames is also useful. It's a bit like the way I've recorded this video here. If you listen to the way I speak, there's a split second gap between every slide, and the reason why I do that is because that way the text the audio is captured within each frame. Okay, so again, watch out for online text and graphics. Sometimes you'll see videos, and especially on training videos, where you'll see text. And remember that text has to be translated. So keep the source files. Remember that if you need to do that, who is going to do the work? Sometimes with video translation, people will just ask us to provide the voice, and then the audio track is simply added to the video. But if there's text, who's going to do that text? You or us? If it's us, you have to send us the entire video editing system. If it's you, we just send you the text and you have to put it on. But it's additional work that someone has to do. So you need to be aware of this in your planning. Again, same thing as we talked earlier, be aware of images and appropriate for international audiences. Some images, even some things like comedy and jokes and things like that, don't work well internationally. You've got to be, what's funny to you may not necessarily be funny in another country. Same things like idioms, puns, play on words. Uh, Very, very difficult to translate. So you need to be aware of that. And Arabic, you've also got cultural sensitivities around male and females, and you know what you can show, and also that the fact that it's right to left. So you need to be aware of things like that. You know, there's a classic video where we talk about. A health company where you've got, you know, or a washing machine company. There's a couple of different versions of this where, yeah, you on the first picture is a picture of dirty clothing, the second picture is a picture of a washing machine, and the third picture is a a product. So if you read it from a European perspective, you know, dirty clothes goes into a washing machine and, you know, comes out clean, right? But if you read it from an Arabic point of view and left to right, it's, you know, you have clean clothing, put it into the washing machine and it comes out dirty. So you have to be aware of those type of things. You might have to flip your images around on the screens. So be aware of that. Finally, then you need to think about review and feedback. So one of the things that's important, who knows your brand? You know your brand better than anyone else, and we are only your partner. So your partner's there to help you. We don't know everything about everybody's products, right? Um, so we're looking to learn from you. This is a circular learning process. So, for example, do you have in-country salespeople? And if you're using, you should always use your own salespeople to review your translation because they know what the brand is like and how you want it to be portrayed in that country. But you have to be aware that to make sure that they stay on brand too. We've heard, we have had experience where we've had local sales teams modify the translations that we've sent. And you know, while the translation might still be okay, it's not on brand with what the customer wanted to say in the first place. So they're literally changing the content, and that's not really appropriate for some companies. You need to make sure your brand is the same and the translation is solid enough, right? Um, Remember, as I was saying, we are experts in what we do, but we don't know everything about every product, and we will modify, you know, the translation accordingly as we learn from you. As you saw earlier, I talked about context and translation. As we don't know how to use every single machine in the world, so as we translate those machines and we learn bits and pieces from them, we modify that text and the translation and the technology behind the technology information behind that for you, right? Everything we store is we have a translation memory system. So every sentence we store for customer is stored, and that allows us to reuse it. So over a period of time, you're actually building up a brand asset in that translation memory, and your translation gets technically better and it gets more consistent, and the quality improves, and overall your cost will decrease as well. So the key thing to remember is that, like, when you see a problem, you need to identify a problem, the source of that problem, and then build a solution together. And over time, your translation gets better and better and better and better, and your business grows accordingly. So that's what you need to be thinking about all the time. So review and feedback a really, really important part of the translation process. So let's review a little bit of what we sort of covered and what we learned today. So we've learned a bit about localization design and getting it right at the start. You've learned all about how to protect your brand through things like term management and helping the translators by providing context. Part of the brand as well then is also using the customer's language, so that it's easy for the customer to understand and easy for the customer to use. So it builds up the customer experience and gives a great product experience for them. You need to also think about multimedia and how best to introduce that and implement it in your translation process. And then finally is review and feedback to be able to bring the whole process together. And remember, all of these terms are a continuous loop. You know, you may go through this entire product and you see something, oh, next time we design a product, we'll put that in. And that's part of the review process back to your designers as well. So that's sort of Star. That's today. Hopefully you've learned a reasonable amount from today. Star has experience in translating in over 200 languages. We have offices in 35 countries, and we've been around for quite a long time in terms of the translation. So we do everything from you know, standard European translation to French, German, to Chinese and Korean, some of the more exotic languages. So we're quite familiar with the different issues and the localization issues. So one of the things we always say, look, if you need information, always give us a call and we're there to help. And finally, look, if you wanted to learn more about this, we do have some design guides that we have on our website that are free to download. We have a design guide for faster translation, which helps around some of the localization issues in terms of how best to design an InDesign file, for example, for to make the translation easier, and our buyer's guide to translation as well, about how to engage with a translation company, so to ask them the right questions to get the best from your budget and from the translation process. So that's it for today, and I hope to see you soon.